All right, let's continue with our case for Israel, making the case for Israel, their right to the land, the Jewish people's homeland, the nation of Israel. Let's take a quick overview of what we covered thus far. We are in a section called the Biblical Record, which takes us from 2000 BC, the time of Abraham, takes us all the way through the period of the New Testament, and about 100 years past the time of Yeshua, past the time of the Gospels, all the way to the Second Roman Revolution. We broke down this large period with discussing covenants, like, for example, the Abrahamic covenant, and we saw how the birth of Ishmael directed the Abrahamic covenant not to Ishmael, but to Isaac. We saw how the death of Sarah impacted not the Abrahamic covenant, but the Abrahamic family, in that Sarah needed to be buried somewhere, and Abraham actually purchased a piece of property in the land of Israel, right outside of Hebron, called Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah, where the patriarchs and the matriarchs, starting with Sarah, are buried, right outside of Hebron. There you can see it, just to the west of the center of the Dead Sea. We saw the death of Abraham impact the Abrahamic covenant in that it goes not to Ishmael, but to Isaac. And from Isaac, it passes on to Jacob. And after Jacob, it passes on to the 12 tribes, to the 12 sons of Jacob. And we see the expectation of Joseph regarding the return of the Jewish people to the land of Canaan, the promised land, that they would not remain in Egypt forever. They would be returning to the promised land. That is Joseph's expectation. Even though Joseph himself died in the promised land, he expected eventually his remains would be carried up by the children of Israel when they returned from their time in Egypt. We were introduced to Moses. We saw how before even the Abrahamic covenant, or before the Mosaic covenant was granted, how Moses bases a great amount of Exodus argument, both coming from the mouth of the Lord, the argument used by the Lord for why he's getting them out of Egypt, and Moses himself arguing with God. Both of them will argue on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant and the right for the Jewish people, the promise, the guarantee of the Jewish people to possess the land of promise, the land of Canaan. We were introduced to the Mosaic covenant. In the Mosaic covenant, we saw, in contrast to the Abrahamic covenant, that while the Abrahamic covenant, the possession of the land, the right to the land, is eternal and not based upon anything the Jewish people do or do not do, the enjoyment of each generation of that land is dependent on fidelity to the Mosaic covenant. So while on the larger macro sense, the land belongs to the Jewish people, not every generation has an automatic guarantee to enjoy that land depending on their fidelity to the covenant. We saw the allotment of the land. The striped area is what is promised in Genesis 15. The green area, or the pink area with the green area, is what Moses directs them to take before he passes off the scene. He charges Joshua and the next generation to take that amount of land. They actually only wind up taking what's in the green under Joshua, although we'll see that that is going to ebb and flow over time. But that is the basic borders of the promised land as the scripture lays them out thus far. So, now we see today, we will finish up the Mosaic covenant, turn and set your journey, go to the hill country of the Amorites and to all their neighbors in the Arava, to the hill country, the lowland, and the Negev, and by the seacoast, the totality, in other words, of the promised land. the land of the Canaanites, and Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. You'll remember that the river Euphrates is up there at the top. The river Euphrates doesn't touch modern-day Israel at all. Never, can't possibly, because you've got, first of all, you've got Lebanon on the sea, you've got Syria next to it, and then you have Iraq going up from there. So, but that's the promised land according to Moses. See, I've placed the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your fathers. Now, this is a reference not to the Mosaic covenant, but to the Abrahamic covenant, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to them and their descendants after them. So, entwined together, the Mosaic covenant entwined with the Abrahamic covenant. The Mosaic covenant can't possibly, many of the laws within the Mosaic covenant obviously cannot even go into effect outside of the land. It anticipates taking the land, and there they must do so, but they are going to take the land on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant. So, now we're going to introduce a third covenant. We've seen the Abrahamic covenant, we've seen the Mosaic covenant, and now we look at a third covenant, and we find this covenant in Deuteronomy. Now, many people have never heard of this covenant. Many people have never heard of this covenant. In some circles, it used to be called the Palestinian covenant, which was never a good name for it. But for 2,000 years, since the Romans, this land had been known as Palestine, Syria, Palestina, and so it was just a convenient term to be used, but I find it confuses people because there is such a thing as a Palestinian covenant. That's the document that was drafted in 1964, dedicated to the destruction of the Jewish people and the eradication of the Jewish people from the land of Israel, and that's not what the Bible's talking about. So to remove all confusion and ambiguity, I will simply refer to this as the land covenant. Now, many people, they don't see a second covenant within the books of Moses next to the Mosaic covenant. They actually see this as a reiteration of it. And I have to tell you that I think that is just plain sloppy reading of the text. A careful reading of the text demarcates a different covenant, one that speaks of the Jewish peoples. No matter what they do, they are going to be returned to the land. It's based upon the Abrahamic covenant. It's similar to the Mosaic covenant, which treats the fact that the Jewish people are going to lose enjoyment of the land. They will not be in physical possession of the land at all points of their history. But there is a certainty in this covenant that no matter if the Jewish people lose temporary possession or lose enjoyment of the land, they will nonetheless, on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant, on the basis of God's faithfulness to his promises, they will eventually be returned to the land, because enjoyment is one thing, ownership is another. And just because you own something doesn't mean you're going to live there during all periods of time of ownership. That's what the Mosaic covenant is very clear on. So, if we look at Deuteronomy 29:1, you'll see why this is another covenant. These are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the sons of Israel in the land of Moab. Is the land of Moab at Mount Sinai? It is not. The land of Moab is today in modern-day Jordan. It is on the east side of the Jordan River. The Mount Sinai, where Horeb, where the Mosaic covenant was given, is in the Sinai desert. These are two different places. So first of all, we have a covenant that is made not at Horeb, but in the land of Moab. And then he goes on to say, in case there's any confusion, besides the covenant, or alongside of, in addition to the covenant which he had made with them at Horeb. Now, I have great respect for Bible scholars who have not recognized that, but I think sometimes it's easy to overlook something if you're not reading it as carefully as you may need to. So I'm not making excuses or explanations for people who don't see an extra covenant here, but now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it, and therefore I teach the land covenant, because once again, it is made not at Sinai, it is made in the land of Moab with the people of Israel, with the children of Israel, and it is besides or in addition to the covenant that was made at Sinai. So it is not just another way of saying Mosaic covenant. It is an additional covenant. Having said that, it says here in verse 10 and 29, you stand today, all of you, before the Lord your God, your chiefs, your tribes, your elders, and your officers, even all the men of Israel, the whole mishpacha. You stand today. Yous are the guys that I'm going to make this covenant with. I'm making this covenant with. And that you may enter into the covenant with the Lord your God. Now, if it's the Mosaic covenant, well, they've already entered into that. They entered into that 38 years ago, 39 years ago, earlier. But no, this is something they're entering into now, contemporaneously. This is a next generation covenant. It's like a cherry covenant on the top of the covenant cake of the Mosaic covenant. That you may enter into the covenant with the Lord your God, and into his oath, which the Lord your God is making with you, not 39 years ago, but is making with you today, now, contemporaneously, second generation covenant. Why? In order that he may establish you today as his people, and that he may be your God, just as he spoke to you, and as he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the basis of this land covenant is actually the Abrahamic covenant. It is alongside the Mosaic covenant, but the foundation of the land covenant is the Mosaic covenant, based upon the promises, because when God makes a promise, he does not take it back. He keeps his word. He is faithful to the promises he makes to his people. And now, not with you alone. So not just second generation, not just yous guys, am I making the covenant and this oath. Not with you alone, but both with those who stand here with us today in the presence of the Lord our God, and with those who are not with us here today. What are you talking about? Dead Jews in memoriam? No, this is talking about progeny. What the Constitution of America calls our posterity. This is being made with the people of Israel and their posterity, their progeny. So it shall be. And it needs to be made not only with the people, because the people of Israel taking the land that Moses is addressing now, they are going to successfully conquer the land under Joshua. And we'll read the story in Joshua. They're not going to be removed from the land. They're going to enjoy the land. They possess the land. They enjoy the land. They own the land. They don't take all of it. It's going to be a big problem for them, we see in Judges, because they didn't take it all. But nonetheless, they take most of it. a great all the central areas that they needed to take to be able to make a nation, but not enough to be able to overcome the hostility from other neighbors that we see in Judges. That's why Judges is structured the way it is. It is a reminder that Joshua and that generation didn't finish the job. The point being, they're not going to be removed from the land. But a future generation, part of the posterity of those who are going to successfully conquer the land in the next few years, they are going to be removed from the land. And it shall be when these things have come upon you. Oh, I'm sorry. We're in Deuteronomy 30 now. And this is the heart of the land covenant. Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 through 10. It assumes what the Mosaic covenant has already told them, that there are consequences for disobedience. And Israel, the posterity of Israel, is eventually going to become so disobedient that God, even though he does not take the right to the land away from the Jewish people, he will physically remove generations of the Jewish people from the enjoyment of the land they own in order to work out the consequences of their disobedience or their fathers' disobedience. So it shall be, when all these things have come upon you, and 29 is filled with blessings and curses, when all these things have come upon you, blessings for obedience, and the curse which I set before you, and you call them to mind in all nations where the Lord your God has banished you. You got to give God a lot of credit because he knows his people. They talk a good game. Jewish people throughout our history, we have talked a good game. But when it came time to faithfulness or rebellion, well, even a cursory examination of the Hebrew Bible would reveal to us that rebellion is the national pastime of Israel, of my people, and that they will be removed from the land. So when this happens, and when they are bearing the consequences, they will have been removed from the land, they will have been dispersed to every nation. But when you call them to mind in all nations where the Lord your God has banished you, dispersion from the land, exile, that's not the end of the story. Oh, no, no. And you return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and soul according to all that I command you today, you and your sons, your posterity's posterity, then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity and have compassion on you and will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. So, if the Jewish people are temporarily removed from the land, from the time of Moses, the understanding has been that is just a temporary circumstance. It may be a lengthy temporary circumstance, but it is a temporary circumstance with a beginning and an ending. And we have, of course, the exile to Babylon. That only lasted 70 years. That was a short-term lack of enjoyment of the land for basically 2 generations. Were removed from the land, couldn't enjoy the land. After the Roman destruction of the temple, the first Roman revolution, followed by their grandchildren's second Roman revolution in 135, which we'll cover eventually, we see the Jewish people dispersed from the land again. A good portion of them remain in the land, but a larger portion are killed or removed. And it is a worldwide exile, what's called the diaspora, that the Jewish people experience. Lack of enjoyment of the land while the land is trodden underfoot by the control, by the authority of Gentile powers. Now, this is not a 70-year blip in history. This winds up being a 1900-year period of time. But short period or long period, the principle is laid out here that ownership of the land remains in the hands of the Jewish people in God's eyes, even if they themselves, or the majority of them, do not get to enjoy the land themselves. Because the Lord will gather them again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. And if your outcasts are at the ends of the earth, no matter where they are, if they're in Russia, if they're in America, Argentina, England, Australia, New Zealand, wherever they are, ends of the earth, there the Lord your God will gather you. From there God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. Bring you back to what? Bring you back to obedience? Bring you back to relationship with the Lord? No, context is everything. It's talking about the land. Bring them back to their land. Why their land? Because it is their land. That's the promise God made to Abraham, reiterated to Isaac, to Jacob, and then throughout Israel's history. The Lord your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed. We're not trading it out. Not trading it out for Uganda or any other nation. Right? It's the land which your fathers possessed. Israel. And you shall possess it. And he will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. Moreover, but wait, there's more. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the hearts of your descendants, your posterity, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. The Lord your God will inflict all these curses on your enemies and all those who hated you, who persecuted you. And you shall again obey the Lord and observe all his commandments which I command you today. Then the Lord your God will prosper you abundantly in all the work of your hand, in the offspring of your body, and the offspring of your cattle, and in the produce of your ground. For the Lord will again rejoice over you for good, just as he rejoiced over your fathers. If you obey the Lord your God to keep his commandment. Whoa, hang on just a second there. That's New American Standard. That if is actually not in the text. The word is ki. It's a preposition. Hebrew. Means when or for or because. Rarely, if ever, means if. And in fact, I know it could not possibly mean if here in this passage, because A, context, there's nothing ambiguous or uncertain about whether the Jewish people are going to return to the Lord and whether he returns to them. That is certain. It's already been established. So there's no ambiguity. If maybe the Jewish people will turn themselves around, maybe they're done with. Maybe they're supposed to be in the ash bin of world history. Depends on if they can get their acts together or not, right? No. That if doesn't belong there. There's no if There's no and there's no but. It's a when, a for. How do I know that? Because in this same passage, which began with 10 verse 1, and now we're in 10 verse 10, this whole passage that we've read contains the word ki, and it's not translated as if previously. The only reason to stick an if in there is if there's anything uncertain about the future of the Jewish people and whether or not they will be reconciled once again to their God. And I can tell you, as sure as I'm standing here, that the Jewish people have a future, and that God is not done with them, and that the future of the Jewish people is dependent on their relationship to the land of promise. So if you obey the Lord your God, when you obey the Lord your God, because you are going to obey the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes which are written in this book of the law, if you turn, or when you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. It's what we pray every Saturday, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your Shema Yisrael. You know what I'm talking about, right? The Ve'ahavta. Next week, we're going to talk about Joshua, the conquest, and the Abrahamic covenant. We'll move from Joshua. We'll recover from our study of the land covenant. We'll see the conquest of the land. We will see David receive the Davidic covenant and how the covenant that God makes with David relates to these other covenants, and specifically to the land promise. And then finally, we will get to, next time, we will look at the way the new covenant functions. For right now, I want to do a little preview of the new covenant as we take communion together. So.